Dear students, colleagues, distinguished guests, it's a pleasure and honor for me to be replaced for this lecture by Professor Robert Frank from Cornell University in the state of New York in the United States of America. Let me tell two comments, otherwise I'm able to speak an hour and this is not important for today. The first comment, after the revolution in the year 1990, a group of teachers at the Department of Economics, Management and Power or something like that were appointed to teach economics or similar science. We had no knowledge about this subject. We were educated in Marxism, Leninism, so that for us it was a shock. And there was a big help organized by Professor Staller. Professor Staller left this country when he was 18 years old, and then in the year 90, he was a distinguished professor at Cornell University. He made an agreement with Charles University in Prague to educate teachers in economics. Me and my colleagues simply attended several weeks. We are not sure if 4, Bob, is it so? Of Professor Frank. I was impressed by him, and I am very happy you can also listen to one of his lectures. But the second point, the year 2001, on September 9, me and Professor Study, who know him, vice rector of this university, were in Cornell for a visit. Next day, you know that there was a big event of terrorists in New York, and we had to spend several days, I think more than 2 weeks, and I had the occasion to see the manuscript of new book of Professor Frank. And this book was so good, so nice, that I came to Prague and asked several publishers, Grada, Olympia, I don't know whom else, to translate and publish this book. They told me, no, we don't have translators, we don't have money, they didn't have anything. So I collected 4 colleagues from Department of Economics. We became translators, and he translated the book. I'm sorry the book is not here. Is here? Oh, I am very proud of that, because it was half a year of my life and a lot of time of my colleagues. But there is one more book. Where is my second book? No. The second one. Here.
Microeconomics and the year.
I'm sorry, I'm not well organized. So, a couple of years before that, me and 2 colleagues from Charles University translated only micro. The book is thick. I was proud of that, but I'm sorry, I have to admit it's thick because this is the cheapest paper, and that's why it's simply not the first class book. Enjoy Professor Frank. Bob, will you allow students to ask questions, or you would like to finish all lecture and then people to ask you something or to make comments?
Okay, what I'll say about that is this. You asked me to speak about the 3 ideas I thought were most important and have 25 minutes each. And that uses up all our time. But I've been told that the room is available afterwards, and I'm happy to stay for questions as long as possible. If we have too many questions during the talk, that's okay too, but then I won't finish the third part of the talk, so it's up to people.
So questions after when you have finished?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick.
You have better device, so I can throw that out of window. Enjoy the class.
Thank you so much, Helena. So pleased to have had this chance to see you again after so many years. We were having dinner in a pub the other night, the surviving translators of the book project, and I forget what the context in our conversation was, but Helena described herself as a woman who gets things done. And if you know her, that's absolutely was my impression of her from the very first time that I met her. She makes things happen. I want to try to persuade you that economic ideas are more useful and interesting, I won't say than you think, but than that many people think. When I was first in my assistant professorship at Cornell, several different friends in different cities sent me this cartoon from the New Yorker. A woman's introducing her friend to another person at a cocktail party. I'd like you to meet Marty Thorndecker. He's an economist, but he's really very nice. Everybody immediately understands why it's funny, but why is it funny? I already, when I got these cartoons sent to me, I said, I already know about this because 2 years earlier, when I first arrived at Cornell in 1972, they had receptions for the new faculty, and I went to meet people from other departments. And in these conversations, people would ask, what department are you in? We were having, up until that moment, a very lively and animated conversation. I would say, I'm in the economics department. And you could see immediately a screen come down. How can I get out of this conversation that they wanted to know? And eventually I started asking them, why are you so disappointed to learn that I'm an economist? And I expected they would say, oh no, I wasn't, but they were surprisingly honest. They would try to think, well, why was I so disappointed to learn that you're an economist? And the most common answer I got when I posed that question was, oh, I took this economics course in college years ago, and there are all these horrible equations and graphs. That's what they say. And I think what's true is that we really don't do a very good job. I'm going to try to persuade you in the first part of my talk how a better understanding, and it doesn't require any equations and graphs really, of economic ideas can not only improve your ability to see and interpret what you see in the world around you, but it will also make you a much more interesting person, and it also will help you make better decisions. That's a pretty tall order for economic ideas. What we know, and these are data from the US, I don't know that it's true here. Maybe Helena has a different experience. I'm sure her students would have a different experience from the one we found, but in the introductory economics course in the US, nobody learns anything. How do we know that? Because we give students tests that probe their understanding of basic economic principles 6 months after they took the course, and they don't do any better on those tests than other students who even took the course. I mean, think about that. How many hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of person hours devoted to these courses every semester, and zero measurable value added. They don't learn anything. That's a shameful performance, and the question is, why is that? I think there are many reasons, but the most important one is professors ask themselves the wrong question. They say, how much can I cover today? And now we have slides, videos. If I show 100 slides in an hour, oh, I really taught them a lot today. But it's the wrong question to be asking. You should ask, how much can they absorb today, and in what form can they most readily absorb it? That's the better question to ask. And the answer to that question doesn't produce the kind of lecture that you see in the economics classrooms, in my experience. My initial orientation towards teaching was formed by my experience as a Peace Corps volunteer trainee. Right after college, I went to Hawaii with a group of 30 others. We were going to go to Nepal in 12 weeks' time and I was going to be a math and science teacher in a Nepali high school. None of us knew one word of Nepali. So 12 weeks later, I'm going to be standing up there speaking in Nepali, trying to explain math and science. I was very frightened at the idea of that. I had had 4 years of Spanish. I went to Spanish-speaking countries. Nobody could understand me. I had a year of German. I went to Berlin. Nobody could understand me. And so if that was the experience we were in for, that was not a very pleasant prospect. But the language training method in our program was completely different from the program that I had had in high school and college. We didn't learn any grammar. After 2 years living in Nepal, I got the highest grade on the Foreign Service language exam when they gave it at our time of exit. He said, nobody would know that you weren't a native speaker. And yet, if he asked me, what's the Nepali word for noun? What's the Nepali word for verb? I would say, I don't know. I have no idea. Just like a little kid has no idea what the words for those things are. But you don't need the words for those things when you're talking to people. The aim of the Nepali language program was to mimic the way a small child learns to speak. You keep it very simple. You name some things that you can see. Then you introduce some action. You ask a question and you repeat it often. It was a magnificent program. It was 6 hours a day. And we got to Nepal. We were there 3 weeks before school started. And then on day one, I'm standing in front of a room full of 10th graders explaining the lesson in Nepali. It was unbelievable how effective it was. Forever after, my approach to teaching was shaped by the idea that less is more. If you don't do too much, if you pick the most important things and you do them repeatedly, you'll get much more success than if you try to teach people everything. So start simple, repeat it often, drill it. The first sentence I ever said in Nepali was, "Your topi mahango cha." This hat is expensive. It was a great sentence. You have to bargain for everything you buy in the market. And it's a good opening sentence. Then the instructor would say, "Lamba moza," that means long socks. And you would have to say, "I lamba moza mahango chan." These long socks are expensive. You have to change the article, the verb form. If you couldn't do it immediately, then you weren't ready to move on. And so it was just a matter of doing small things well repeatedly. That's the philosophy behind my course. The good news is there's only a small number of basic principles that do most of the work in economics. You don't need 100 ideas to see what's happening. And so I'll focus today in this first part on only one of them. I have 25 minutes for this part. And that's the most important of the principles. It's the cost-benefit principle. You should do it only if the benefit is greater than the cost. It sounds stupid, sounds obvious. People argue about it nonetheless, but the idea is pretty sensible. If the benefit isn't going to be at least as great as the cost of doing it, then you shouldn't do it. So where do you get from that? Here's an example. You're about to buy a clock for 500 Czech crowns at the nearby store on your university campus right next door. A friend tells you you can get that same clock at the Palladium in the center, which is a difficult trip away, but it's only 250 crowns there. Would you go to the center to buy the clock at Palladium? It's just a cost-benefit question. Is it worth it to make the trip to save? Most students, when I ask this question, they say, yes, I would. When I put in the American equivalent, that's an easy choice for them. Okay, I don't say they're wrong to make that choice. But here's another example. You're about to buy a 60,250 Czech crown laptop at the campus store. A friend tells you that the very same laptop is available in the center for only 60,000 crowns. Do you make the trip? This time, most students say they think it's a stupid Why would I go down to the center just to save so little? They say, no, I wouldn't make the trip. But if you do an actual cost-benefit analysis, it's clear that the benefits of the trip are exactly the same in the two cases. What are they? 250 crowns you save. That's the benefit. What's the cost of the trip? Well, we don't have a number, so we have to ask. If somebody gave me 250 crowns, would I go to the center and come back? Would it be worth it to me? If yes, then I should buy both things in the center. If no, I should buy both of them in the campus store. But their own instinct is to get that wrong. Why? If you press them, they'll say, oh, the percentage savings for the computer was so little. But the percentage savings doesn't make any difference. It's not relevant. Students like these examples. Once they get the idea, then they go back to the dormitory and they ask the questions to their friends. And they seem to be very happy when their friend gets it wrong, when their friend makes a mistake. And the beauty of the question is that if you ask it 3 times, then you can never forget the idea. The idea is yours forever if you repeat it just a couple of times like that. Here's an example I made for you. So we've Adamek and Bartosz. They have identical preferences. Maybe they're twins. They're going to an important football game. They have to drive from Prague to Dresden. As it happens, Adamek paid 2,500 crowns for his ticket, but Bartosz got his ticket because somebody who wanted to go couldn't go and just gave him a free ticket. Now comes a very big, heavy snowstorm. Who's more likely to make the trip? The cost-benefit principle says they should be equally likely to make the trip. Why? Because the benefit of the trip is you get to see the game. And since they're twins, they get the same benefit. What's the cost of the trip? It's whatever cost you would require to make you willing to make a drive through a dangerous snowstorm. That's the same for both people. But most people have intuition that tells them, no, Adamek is going to be much more likely to make the trip because he falls victim to the sunk cost fallacy. It's a cost he's incurred, he can never get it recovered, and yet it influences his decision about what to do. Some of you may know this as the Concorde fallacy. Long after the Concorde was shown to be an economic failure, they continued with the project because they had so much invested in it up until then. The most important element in my course is the economic naturalist writing assignment. And this was inspired by my wonderful high school biology teacher, Caspar Wirtz. He taught us some simple evolutionary biology principles, and with just those few principles, you could suddenly see new things in the world, things that you never would have noticed before and that were fun to think about. So, for example, you could pose a question like, why is it in most vertebrate species with backbones, are males bigger and more colorful than the females? An example in the slide here is the bull elephant seal. It weighs 3,000 kilos. The cow next to him weighs 600 kilos, 5-to-1 ratio. Why is it that the males are so much bigger? The answer in Darwinian terms that most vertebrate species are polygynous. That means males take more than one mate if they can. The if they can qualifier is important. If some males take more than one mate, others get none. And that's the ultimate loser position in the Darwinian scheme. So, of course, males take every step they can to get access to females. And one step they take is to fight with other males for access. And so these two bulls have been fighting on a beach for 5 hours. Finally, one of them is exhausted, can't continue, and slunks off. And the winner claims access to a stretch of beach where there are 50 to 100 females. He has exclusive sexual access to them. And if he won his fight because he was a little bigger, because there was a mutation in a gene that made him a little bigger than the others, that mutation is in the pups of all these cows in the next generation. And so the bulls got bigger and bigger and bigger. They didn't get bigger forever, because beyond a certain point, size becomes a cost, and the point where it stopped getting bigger, was way past the point where it would have been best for bulls as a group. Because they're so big, it's very difficult to get enough food to achieve that body weight and maintain it. You're very immobile. The great white shark, your principal predator, has much greater chance of catching you and eating you. And you get arthritis and orthopedic ailments much more readily because you're so big. Being big is good for winning battles with other males, but it's bad for every other reason. And if they could take a vote, they would vote unanimously. We push the red button and suddenly we all weigh half as much. That would be because it's relative size that decides who wins the fight, not absolute size. And the absolute size is a burden once it passes a certain point. Okay, so assignment, just as biology helps you craft narratives that help you understand things you see in the natural world, economic principles help you make narratives that help make sense of things that you see in the built environment. So one of my students, Greg Ballot, asked, why is it that when you drive 2 blocks to the grocery store, the regulators require you to strap your small child into a safety seat in the back seat of your car, yet you're permitted to fly from Prague to New York with your small child sitting loose on your lap? Yeah, it's a similar situation, it seems like. The regulations are different. Why is that? To see whether the question's interesting, I told my students, ask your classmates the question and see how they react. If they yawn or if they look away, maybe you don't have an interesting question. So he asked his classmates this question, and they seemed interested. That was a good first sign. And then they wanted to know the answer, and several of them suggested the same answer. They said, if the plane crashes, you're going to get killed whether you're strapped in or not. So why bother to require strapping the kid in? That sounds reasonable. But Mr. Ballot knew right away that it couldn't be the right answer because they required seat belts in airplanes long before they required them in cars, not to protect you if the plane crashed. Yes, you're all going to die if the plane crashes. To protect you when there's air turbulence. That was the purpose of seat belts. And so if there was a reason for the regulators to behave differently in these two cases, it wasn't on the benefit side of the cost-benefit test. The benefits of being strapped in a plane are also big. It had to be on the cost side. And when he thought about it from that perspective, he saw right away that, yeah, if you're on a full flight from Prague to New York, it might cost you $1,000 to get the seat you'd need to strap your kid into the approved safety seat. So we don't want to say this out loud, but the reason we don't require it on planes for the little kids to be strapped in is that it's too expensive. And if somebody says we shouldn't take costs into account when we're making decisions about safety, ask them, did they get their brakes checked the last time they drove their car? No. Well, why not? I get them checked twice a year. I get them checked once a year. I've got other things to do. We make cost-benefit trade-offs in all of these domains, safety, pollution, everything. And to say costs don't matter is just not to be a member of the world we live in. Another of my students who had gotten married shortly before she took my course asked this question: why is it that brides rent wedding dresses they will never again wear in their lives, and grooms who will have 10, 15, 20 occasions on which to wear a tuxedo, they rent a cheap suit? It sounds like they're doing it exactly wrong. The men ought to buy a tuxedo, and the women ought to rent a dress. And her explanation began a pretty full assumption, which is that on important occasions, it's more important for women to make a fashion statement than it is for men. Why that should be is another interesting question I won't go into, but when I've described this example in many different places, nobody ever says that's not the way it is here. They all say, yeah, that's the way it is here too. If that's the way it is, then a rental company would need to have 30, 40 dresses in each size of dress in order for somebody to avoid the embarrassing situation of appearing in the same dress that somebody wore to a wedding last week that the guests had gone to. So if they had so many dresses in their inventory, the dresses would be idle most of the time. Maybe they would be rented once every 3 or 4 years, and the rental price would have to be more even than the purchase price to make money off that business. Of course, nobody would pay a rental price more than the purchase price, and that's why the brides rent their gowns. The grooms, for some reason, they don't care if they show up in a suit just like the suits that people saw men wearing in a wedding last week. So what? That means a rental company can serve the market with 4 or 5 suits in each size. The suits rent out 7, 8, 9 times a year, and they can be rented for a small fraction of the purchase price. Even how things are changing recently lends extra weight to the validity of her argument. Now with the internet, we're starting to see people rent bridal gowns, and not just ordinary bridal gowns, but $10,000 or $15,000 bridal gowns, because we can now aggregate the entire continent. We can make a business like that be viable. Why is there a light in the refrigerator but not in the freezer? I know in expensive appliances, there's a light in both, but in cheap ones, there's a light in the refrigerator, but not in the freezer. Why this difference? Well, what's the purpose of a light? It's to help you find things. The cost of a light is the same in each compartment. It's a fixed cost. It doesn't matter how many times you open the door. It's a cost. The benefit of the light is, as I say, it helps you see things. And since you open the refrigerator door much more often than you open the freezer door, the benefit of having a light in the refrigerator compartment is simply bigger than the benefit of having a light in the freezer compartment. These are all sensible applications of the cost-benefit principle to things that you observe in the world. I began by showing you how intelligent application of the cost-benefit principle could help you make better decisions. Let me point out now how mastery of these simple principles makes you a more interesting person. This is my old friend George Ainsley. He's a psychiatrist at a veterans hospital near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He said, going forward, one of the most important scarce resources in life will be the willingness of other people to pay attention to us. Everybody's so busy. Everybody's got devices. Everybody's got so many things to attend to. And humans need people to pay attention to them. That's part of how our psychology evolved. And so I'll mention an experience I had. I was in Sicily several years ago. A friend of mine hosted a birthday celebration for his wife, and he invited 15 or 16 of their friends to travel with them to a rented villa in Sicily. And during that trip, during the daytime, we would take automobile side trips to see ruins and other artifacts. I knew some of the people there, but not all of them. I'm by temperament a shy person. And so I was one day in a car with 4 people I didn't know, and they asked me what I did. I said, well, I teach economics. What do you talk to? I said, I told them about the economic naturalist example that I use in my course. And they said, oh, well, give me an example of that. So I recounted a story, maybe one of the ones that I've just shown to you, and then they wanted to hear another one. And I gave them another one, and then a third one. And 1.5 hours passed. Nobody else said a word. I was talking the whole time. They were paying attention to me in a very serious, and oh, that's interesting. So when my students come back from holidays, they say, I give them the best papers on a website. They say, we spent the whole holiday meal going around talking about the economic naturalist examples. And each time you explain one, you get the principle of it more firmly rooted in your mind. But not only that, you have people more willing to pay attention to you. So that's part 1 of my talk. and I'm already behind schedule. I think a lot of people are too skeptical about the power of markets to deliver benefits to human beings. I vote mostly left in the US. To vote right now makes you a very strange animal. So that doesn't tell you very much about me, but I've long voted mostly left. But I do so mainly for pragmatic reasons. And I think many people on the left are insufficiently appreciative of the things we get from the market system. The market system has made a huge difference in all of our lives that I think we take for granted in many ways. So I'll start with Adam Smith's invisible hand. He said it wasn't a new idea with him that the entrepreneurs introduced cost-saving inventions and product design improvements, not for the benefit of society, but to take business away from their competitors. Yeah, that's an old idea. What he added was that the story doesn't stop there. They respond quickly by cutting their own prices and copying the innovations. And then there's a big competitive struggle. And when the dust settles from all that, the beneficiaries are the consumers. They get better quality products at lower prices, and the producers earn only enough money to cover their costs. It's an incredibly elegant argument. Smith didn't think that it described everything. He was amazed that it was often socially beneficial to let the story play out. And a big part of his story was the division and specialization of labor. So he described activity in a pin factory. There were 10 people in this factory. One guy draws out the wire, another cuts it, another one straightens it, a fourth one puts a point on the end of it, then the fifth one grinds the end to receive the head. The head takes another 3 distinct operations. So he's talking about a factory where there were 10 people who in a day could make something like 12 pounds of pins. And then he measures and discovers that there are 4,000 pins in a pound. So these 10 guys in a day make 48,000 pins. So he says each one, therefore, could be considered to make 4,800 pins in a day. And he says, what if they had each worked independently without having specialized or been educated to any of this? He said they might not be able to make 20, maybe not even 1 pin in a day. So it wasn't just you got more productive, you got spectacularly more productive as a result of markets getting denser. He pointed out that the specialization is limited by the extent of the market, so the more dense the market became, the more you could specialize. And look at the graph here. All of human history, we're at subsistence levels of income until Smith's day, when the spike begins. The growth chart goes completely vertical at that point. And you could say, well, what's the big deal? The mansions all get bigger. The rich people aren't any happier than before or healthier. That's true. And we've gotten some additional problems because of all this, the climate crisis foremost among them. But there's enough wealth generated here to solve these problems. And the other main thing to focus on is the human misery that the market has eliminated. So in Britain, in Smith's day, if you had 3 kids, there was a 50% chance that one of them would die before reaching age 15. And even though that was common, it doesn't remove the agony of the experience for the family when something like that happens. Today, 3 kids have a 99.4% chance of reaching adulthood without having succumbed to any fatal illness. It's a huge improvement in the quality of life and the reduction of suffering. Marx didn't think markets were so great. He said they immiserate the worker, they degrade him, they make him into a small fragment of a man. And there was, as anybody who examined the workplace of the early industrial age could attest, the workplace was pretty miserable. There were horrible working conditions. People were often injured and killed for sure in those. And more recently, the critique of markets was embraced by this man. He's the most widely read economist of the 20th century. I don't know how well known in Europe he is, but he introduced what he called the revised sequence, which he offered in contrast to the economist's traditional Adam Smith story. The traditional sequence says the firms look at what people really want, then they try to find the best way to produce high-quality versions of that and then sell it at the most reasonable prices they can to consumers. Galbraith said no. He introduced what he called a revised sequence, according to which the firms look for which products will be cheapest and most convenient for them to produce. Do people want those products? It doesn't matter. We'll just have advertisement that persuade them to buy them. And that's the market economy according to Galbraith. Galbraith's critics, though, had some good questions to ask. They said, what about the Edsel, Professor Galbraith? This was a car introduced by Ford in the mid-1950s. It was introduced with the most expensive advertising campaign ever in history. They had 1 hour long television specials sponsored by Edsel, billboards everywhere, radio spots. People didn't have any interest at all in the Edsel. Hardly anybody bought it, and after 2 years, it was discontinued. You can make them buy anything. What about the Edsel? You say, oh, that's the exception that proves my rule. Well, it doesn't prove his rule. It proves the exact opposite of his rule. So what about that, Professor Galbraith? He didn't really have a proper response. And Milton Friedman was becoming more influential all this time. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was his voice that was the strongest. He was critical of the standard left arguments in a way that was actually much more effective than the left gave him credit for. He liked often to stress the wastefulness of God. They build bridges to nowhere. He once said, if you put the federal government in charge of the Sahara Desert in 5 years, there'd be a shortage of sand. Everybody thought that was a wonderful, witty observation. Yeah, look how wasteful the government is. If you look at the government budgets, mostly they're spent on roads and schools and hospitals, things people seem to care about, but this rhetoric was very effective. Friedman's argument about regulation was very potent relative to the understanding of it by people on the left. So think about safety regulation. As in the example of the safety seats, nothing is completely safe. If somebody says you shouldn't take costs into account when making decisions about safety, then we should build a bridge over every suburban street at the corner, because if we don't do that, sooner or later somebody will get hit by a car and be killed. But nobody thinks we ought to do that because it would be so expensive to do that. And if you just be careful crossing the street, you'll be okay. We can spend that same money on things we care more about. That's a very powerful argument. You can't be perfectly safe. The question is, how safe should we be? And that was Friedman's question. So how safe should the workplace be? He said, imagine that a worker owns his own company. Would he want to put a guardrail on the lathe, something to make it more safe? Well, that would be a cost-benefit question. If he would value the additional safety at $150 and the cost of the guardrail was $100, then of course he should put it on. If he would value the extra safety at only $50 and it cost $100, then he would say, my best bet is just to be careful without the guardrail. But then he pointed out that even if a company owned the workplace, the incentives would be the same. If they didn't put on a guardrail that met the cost-benefit test, there would be cash on the table. And if economists agree about anything at all, it's that cash on the table doesn't sit there very long. What does it mean, cash on the table? It means that if I have a factory and I have workers working on a lathe and there's no guardrail and they'd be willing to pay $150 to have one, and it would only cost me $100 to install it, then a rival could lure them away. They would take a pay cut of $140 if they could get a guardrail because they value the guardrail at more than that. It only costs me $100 to put it on, so I get $40 of extra profit and they're happier. There's cash on the table if you don't install the guardrail according to the cost-benefit test. And where was the left's answer to that argument? It was crickets. You could hear a pin drop. Nobody had a response to that. The biologists weighed in too. They said competition is much more powerful than the left think. And they said, consider the conditions under which trees grow. They're happiest if they're in well-moistened and well-drained soil, loamy soil on flat ground. They'll thrive best. But let them find an opportunity anywhere, even under the most unfavorable conditions. A slight crack in a granite cliff face, a seed falls there, it sprouts, roots fan out into a crack in the rock, then they find a horizontal crack, they go each side, they cover 2 hectares, the roots fanning out, and there's just enough moisture in all that area to support a tree, but it lives there for 1,000 years. If there's a profitable opportunity, somebody will find it. That's the message of this. So if you want to have an argument about why the market is not doing what you want it to do, and if your argument implies that there's cash on the table, you need to think further. Your argument's probably not any good if it implies that there's cash on the table. Here's where I think Darwin really offers us very fruitful ideas for thinking about this kind of problem. I call it Darwin's wedge. Traits are selected because of their impact on the individual organism, not for their effect on larger groups. So many traits benefit individuals and groups, but some are good for the individual. We saw an example of that earlier, but are disadvantageous for larger groups. An example in the invisible hand mold is the eyesight of the hawk. The mutation that coded for keener eyesight in one bird enabled that bird to catch more rats. It had more offspring, the mutation spread. Now all hawks can see incredibly well. If there were a page on the back wall with the phone numbers from the Prague directory, they could read it off if they could read. I could look back there, I wouldn't even see that there was something fastened to the wall. Why do they see so well? Because it was advantageous for the individuals to see well. They raised larger groups of offspring, but it was also advantageous for hawks generally to see well. We already saw how a trait can be advantageous for the individual, the bull, and yet be disadvantageous beyond a certain level for bulls as a group. So traits that benefit the individual can be sometimes disadvantageous for larger groups. We see it in nature in all sorts of ways. So trees compete for light. How do they compete? By getting taller. So we see trees 200 meters tall, and only the very top of them is getting any light because they had to grow that tall because the ones next to them were that tall. If they were each 10 meters tall, they'd get the same amount of light. From the tree's point of view, all that work to grow that tall was wasted. It's maybe good for us that they produce so much wood, but from their point of view, it was a conflict between the interests of the individual and the interests of the group. And that's the key idea I'm going to talk about when I talk about market failure. So another example, we got an initial condition. Everybody's driving 1,200 kilo cars, and then one guy buys a car that weighs 4,000 kilos. Why did he do that? Well, because he had a cousin who got killed in an auto accident last week. He wanted to be safer, so he bought a big car to be safer. And it was rational for him to do that. He is safer. He's very happy about the outcome. But then what was the effect of him buying that big car? It was to make each of the people driving the small cars less safe. What's their best response? Perhaps their best response is to buy a big car too. Then you have everybody with a 4,000 kilo car, and everybody's risk of injury and death is higher than when everybody was driving a 1,200 kilo car. It's again the individual interest versus the group interest. Now, if you're on the left and you hate markets, maybe you would react to this story, say, oh, that's simple, we'll just ban big cars, make them against the law. I don't like remedies like that. Some people have a genuine need for a bigger car. Maybe they work in the trades or they have a boat that they pull up into the mountains on the weekend. And so much better would be to tax cars by weight. That way, we acknowledge that if you buy a heavier car, you harm others. You pay a penalty for harming it. You pay more tax. And the fact that you pay more tax enables the people who don't buy heavy cars to pay lower tax. We need only so much tax. If we tax a harmful activity at a higher rate, we can tax a harmless activity at a lower rate. So here's what I'll call the theoretical section of my talk. My American fellow economists would sneer at this because it's non-mathematical, but it is nonetheless meant to illustrate the main theoretical point I'm trying to make, and I do it with two simple thought experiments. One is a choice of situations in which to live. You can live in world A or world B. You move there, and then the conditions stay the same forever for the rest of your life. You can't change them. So in world A, you live in a 400 square meter house. Everybody else lives in a 600 square meter house. In world B, you live in a smaller house, only 300 square meters, but others live in houses of only 250 square meters. Which would you choose? The standard economic model thinks this is a stupid question. The utility from a house is assumed to depend only on its absolute characteristics. How big is it? How many rooms does it have? Where is it located? So obviously, the world A here is the uniquely correct choice. But when you ask real people, what would they do in this situation? Most people choose world B. I would choose world B. Many people who choose world A aren't puzzled by the fact that others choose world B. Some people choose world A because they think they're not supposed to care about how big other houses are. They really wish they lived in world B, but they were embarrassed to say so. But there are good reasons for choosing a world like B rather than the world like A. But forget that for the moment and just note only that when we have a choice here between absolute advantage, that's world A, and relative advantage, that's world B, people choose relative advantage. Here's the same thought experiment in a different domain. You have a 2 in 100,000 chance of dying on the job this year. Others have a 1 in 100,000 chance of dying. In world B, you're twice as likely to die on the job. Your odds of dying are 4 in 100,000. Everybody else is got 6 in 100,000. So you're relatively safe in world B. You're absolutely more safe in world A. So again, it's a choice between absolute and relative advantage. I said in the first experiment, most people chose world B. Here, it's not a question of most or how many. Everybody that I've ever asked to fill out a form that had this question on it chooses world A. It's not that they don't notice that their relative risk is higher there. They probably don't like that. But if they, you can avoid high relative risk by moving to this other world where you're twice as likely to get injured and killed, no. They said, no, thank you. So relative risk, absolute risk, they choose one way. relative house size, absolute house size they choose. So I'm going to use the terms positional good to describe housing in this example, these two examples, and non-positional good to describe safety. These terms are due to Fred Hirsch. A positional good, as he wrote about it in the 70s, was one whose value depends relatively strongly on how it compares with other goods in the same category. It's not that non-positional goods don't depend on comparisons, they depend less on comparisons. So here's the theory in my theory section. It's in the form of an analogy that invokes the traditional military arms race metaphor, which is uncontroversial. In a military arms race, the story is countries build more bombs because they know it's very dangerous if their rivals have more bombs than they do. So country A builds more bombs, country B builds more, and then they go back and forth. If you build more bombs, you can't have as many toasters. There's only so much money to go around. You can't have as many hospitals and schools and roads and houses and other things. Why do they build too many bombs? Why don't they have an arms race on houses and toasters? Well, because falling behind on bombs is really dangerous. It's not pleasant if they have better toasters than we do, but we can live with that. So whenever relative comparisons matter more for some goods than others, as they do by definition for positional goods relative to non-positional goods, we get an arms race. We suck resources out of the non-positional category and use them to pay for additional expenditures in the positional category. That's the story of market failure that I'm offering. We have the wrong mix of goods and services, not because, as the behavioral economists say, people are irrational. Yeah, that's a problem sometimes, but that's not the main problem. Not because capitalists exploit workers, that's not the problem. The problem is we spend too much on positional goods and not enough on non-positional goods. I'll read one sentence from Galbraith's book, The Affluent Society, which argues that we have too many private goods and not enough public goods. The family which takes its mauve and cerise, those are two colors, most of my students wouldn't know that. It's mauve and cerise, air-conditioned, power-steered, power-braked automobile out for a tour. This was written in 1955 when hardly any cars had such unbelievably luxurious features. Takes it out for a tour, passes through cities that are badly paved, made hideous by litter, blighted buildings, and posts for wires that should have long since been put under the ground. We have too many private consumption goods, positional goods, too few non-positional goods, public goods, and the like. That was Galbraith's criticism, and it was exactly right, but he was right for the wrong reason, I argue. It's not because of advertisements and greedy firms and irrational consumers. It was because we naturally spend too much on positional goods and too little on non-positional goods. And education figures prominently in this. Everywhere in the world, there are good schools and bad schools. Where are the good schools and what is a good school? It's a relative concept. It's a school that's better than the other schools. Where are they? They're in the more expensive neighborhoods. Do you want to send your children to a good school? What would we think of a parent who said, no, I don't care about that? We would think ill of any such parent. The good schools are in the more expensive neighborhoods. If you want to send your kid to a better school, you got to bid more intensively for a house in such a neighborhood. If you're the average earner, you can't send your child to a school even of average quality unless you buy the median priced house for your area. We would think ill of a parent who didn't try hard to achieve at least that much. So go back to the safety regulation question. Should we put a guardrail on the lathe? Well, if I'm a worker and company A has a guardrail and company B doesn't have a guardrail, I can earn a higher wage at company B because they didn't make the expense of putting on the guardrail. I choose to do that. Why? Because the extra money I get will enable me to bid more effectively for a house served by good schools. I don't regret doing that. It was a rational choice I made. But what happens when we all do that? We all get more money. We all work in riskier jobs. And the end result is merely to bid up the prices in the houses, of the houses in the better school districts. And half of all kids go to bottom half schools just the same as before. Elizabeth Warren, the US Senator, wrote a book with her daughter in which she asked, why was it that parents could get by on a single paycheck in the 1950s? Now they have two people working, earning more money, and they can't pay their bills. Why is that? The answer is the extra paycheck went for a fruitless bidding war for houses in the better school districts. That's the market failure. So we've got a choice to make. This is the choice we're making in the US. We could have either one of these societies for the amount of income that we're capable of generating. We could have a society with big houses, with heavy expenditures on weddings, very expensive cars, short vacations, poor quality infrastructure, not much investment in renewable energy, hospital surge capacity, never mind that. We could have a society like that. That's the one we have. Or we could adopt policies that would divert resources in such a way as to get a society like B. There's a very clear literature now on the determinants of human flourishing, and it establishes without any debate whatsoever, there's a lot of debate in this literature, but there's no debate that the conditions of society B will result in people who are happier and healthier than the conditions in society A. There's no question about that. Why don't we have society B? Because the government has to intervene with policies to steer individuals in different directions from what it would otherwise be in their individual interest to do. It's the conflict between the individual and the group. Here are the happiness levels in a selected group of countries: Finland, Denmark, Iceland, Switzerland, and every year they're in the top 5 happiest countries. And how's that determined? They ask you, the World Happiness Report asks you a question, one question: all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? 10 means you're as satisfied as you could possibly be. 0 means I'm as dissatisfied as I could possibly be. These are the raw scores. The US is the least happy among all wealthy countries. And the difference between the top 5 and the US is exactly as reflected in that table I just showed you. The US spends much less on non-positional goods, much more on positional goods than these countries. That concludes part 2 of my talk. Let me ask how I'm doing. I have now, you said I had 25 minutes per talk. That's 2 talks. It's taken me an hour. The third part is a little shorter than the first 2. So I think I can get through the third one, but if people are restless and feel like they want to go do something else, I would listen to feedback. I'm looking to Helena for guidance, but your guidance is not informative. I know what you were going to say. Well, you can always leave if you feel like it. The last part of my talk concerns forging relationships of trust. We don't talk about this much in economics. We should talk about it more because it's very important. And I hope the ideas I'll present in this third part of the talk will have 2 effects on you. They will, I hope, increase your desire to form relationships of trust with others, and they will inform you about why that's important and how it might be facilitated. So here's a question that economic theory doesn't answer in a very accurate way. So we have a hypothetical situation here. The CEO of a company could increase his company's earnings by telling a lie that could not possibly be detected. Maybe his company did something illegal, and there's no way anybody could see evidence of that. He was asked whether the company had done that. He destroyed the evidence, and so he said no, and there's no penalty. What's the prediction? Would he lie or wouldn't he lie? 10, if you pick 10 on this scale, you think he would lie for sure. If you pick 0, you think he wouldn't, there's no chance he would lie. Traditional economic theory has an answer here, and the answer is 10. If you didn't lie, others would lie, and they would gain an advantage relative to you, and that would eventually spell your bankruptcy in the long run. So economic theory needs to come up with another narrative, because we know that there are some people who don't lie in these situations. I'll describe some experiments later on. Biology, when I was first investigating this question, really didn't have a very good narrative for how to deal with the question of why people don't cheat when there's no opportunity to be detected and punished. Normally in biology, we say that the organism who gets more resources rears larger number of offsprings. That was always the case in the environments in which we evolved. And so if you could lie and get more resources, then the theory predicts that you would lie. If you didn't lie, you would be replaced in the evolutionary struggle by an organism that would lie. Well, what did biologists have to say about the fact that some people didn't lie under various circumstances? Robert Trivers, an old friend of mine who was very influential writer in the 1970s, offered his theory of reciprocal altruism. We incur costs to help others. We tell lies in the expectation that others will repay the favor in the future. Obviously, that often happens. I help you today, you help me tomorrow. That's a big part of what makes relationships work in the world. But there are lots and lots of cases where there's simply no prospect that there will be a reciprocation in the future. And yet, many people cooperate even in those cases. This is William Hamilton. His story was the well-known kin selection model. We grew up, we evolved in groups of highly related individuals. And he noted, for example, that if you could save the lives of 3 siblings at the expense of your own life, that would be a genetic bargain for you. Your siblings have half of your genes in each of them. And so if you saved 3 siblings and you died, then there would be more of your genes in going into the future than if you had survived and the 3 siblings had been killed. I could save the lives of 8 first cousins, and that would be a good deal for me. Or 9, I guess, to break the tie. So that's why we're cooperative, because we evolved in small groups and everybody was related to everybody. Well, we weren't all that related to everybody. In even family gatherings, where it's only family who are invited to these gatherings, there are many second cousins. Second cousins are the children of first cousins. My second cousins and I share 3.125% of our genes in common. That's like a perfect genetic stranger. Why should I give up a big portion of my well-being to promote the propagation of genes of a person who hardly has any genes like mine? That's not a good explanation. Here's David Sloan Wilson. He's the champion of group selection in biology. And his story makes sense. He said some groups had strong cultural norms. They punished cheaters. They were very vigilant to ensure rewards for cooperation and so on. And groups like that grew richer and they competed effectively against groups that didn't have norms. And so that's why we see cooperation. Fine, I have no quarrel with that story, but it doesn't answer the question of why you would refrain from cheating when there's no possibility that you would be caught and punished from cheating. Sure, you would cooperate when you're under the microscope and people can tell whether you've cooperated, but what about when no one's looking? That's the question. So 3 of us happen to be troubled by this unresolved issue in the literature at about the same time. David Gautier, a philosopher, published Morals by Agreement in 1985. He used the example of nuclear deterrence. So Russia attacks the United States. We retaliate against Russia, and the fact that we have threatened to retaliate against an attack means they won't attack it. That argument didn't make any sense, many people had noted, because if they attack us, that's really bad for us. But if we don't retaliate, then the world would eventually recover and life would go on. If we retaliate, then the whole world dies. The nuclear poison engulfs the world and nobody survives. So if they retaliate, if they launch a strike against us, the rational response from us is not to retaliate. So we say, don't strike us or we'll retaliate. That's an incredible threat. It's not a credible threat. He said the solution was to predispose yourself to retaliate. He didn't go into any detail how you would do that, but suppose you could do that. The more important question, I think, is how would you persuade them that you had done that? How would they know you were predisposed to retaliate? And if they didn't know it, they would think, since it's not rational for you to retaliate, you won't retaliate. Because he said, if you're predisposed to retaliate, it's rational to retaliate. The philosophers just couldn't accept that. They dismissed him. He became a peripheral figure shortly after. It was the right idea if you could somehow commit yourself. If you could make a doomsday machine, something that would automatically retaliate, that would be a solution to the commitment problem. But that was, he just had a vague, said you have to predispose yourself. Jack Hirschleifer, a very, very insightful economist at UCLA, said that we commit ourselves to what would otherwise be irrational acts by emotions that push us to do it. That was exactly the same narrative I was working on at the same time. The difference was that Hirschleifer seemed uninterested in how somebody would know you were emotionally predisposed to retaliate or to deliver on a promise that it wouldn't pay you to deliver. How would anybody know? That was, as I saw it, the heart of the problem. How does anybody know that you're going to do something that from your own narrow perspective would be irrational when the time comes? So here's a prototypical problem of the type to be solved. I call it the branch outlet problem. I have a successful business here, and there's a city hundreds of kilometers from here where the conditions in the market are the same. The business would be a success there too, if only I had time to go there and manage it. I don't. So I need to hire a manager to do that. And so I interview candidates. What I know, though, is that if the manager cheated me in the distant location, I would have no way to know about that. I can put cameras on the wall, I can have accountants look at the book, but they have so many ways to cheat that I could never catch him. So I interview them. That's point A in the decision tree here. If I open the new office, I know I'll be at C, and then it's the manager's turn to decide what to do. He said he would manage honestly, but of course everyone would say that. He can either manage honestly, in which case we'll both get a good payoff, 1,000 each, or he could cheat, and I would have no way of knowing that he cheated. There's many ways the business could fail besides him cheating, but if he cheats, he'll get a much bigger payoff, 2,500. I'll get a payoff of minus 500. I know that if I don't even open the building, I'll get 0, and he'll have to make do with the next best job on offer, which I assume is 500. So what's going to happen here? This is a very simple game. The sub-game perfect solution to it is the owner anticipating that the manager, if he were hired at C, would choose to manage dishonestly, says, I can do better by choosing the bottom branch at C, and so I don't open the business. I lose relative to what I could have earned, but so does he. We both could have done better if he could have committed himself to manage honestly. So how could I know somebody would manage honestly? How do we make decisions about it? So here's an Art Modell New Yorker cartoon that I think captures the essence of the part of the idea involved. The husband says to his wife, says, we should buy a pencil, dear. We don't need a pencil. Well, he'll whip us if we don't buy a pencil. Ridiculous. He won't whip us. If he whipped us, he would go to jail. And who would do that just to sell a pencil? And it really is just a device by the cartoonist to make sure you get the point. If you're flipping through the pages quickly, he puts the sign saying irrational. So the wife says, well, maybe he's not using the standard cost-benefit tests when he decides whether to whip the non-pencil buyer. Actually, if he's so smart that he knows that sign helps his case, then he probably is using the but it's really the expression on his face that makes you, that gives you a reason to buy a pencil. Look at that. It's just a few ink lines. Go home tonight and stand in front of your mirror and try to make that expression. You know, unless you're really troubled psychologically, you won't be able to do that very convincingly. Somebody who looks like that probably isn't playing with a full deck. And so we buy the pencil. He has committed himself to use the whip if they don't buy a pencil, but the beauty is he doesn't have to use the whip because the fact that they see he's committed to do that means they buy the pencil. So if the narrative makes no sense to you in memory, go back to that picture, it's all there. So can we predict who will do what in a situation where there's no objective way we could know whether they had met our prediction? And this thought experiment, I ask you to imagine that you've just gotten home from a crowded concert. You've lost 100,000 Czech crowns. They had been in an envelope in your coat pocket. You stood up to leave. You were putting your coat on. You get home and you see that the envelope's no longer there. It had your name and address on it and all that cash. And you realize, oh, that sound I heard as I was putting on my coat must have been the sound of the envelope as it hit the floor when I was standing to leave. Can you think of anybody not related to you but by blood or marriage who you feel sure would return your cash if he or she found it? I've asked this question to many people. Almost always people say, well, yeah, I can think of people. Most people say they can think of people who would return even a stranger's cash if they found it. When they name people who would return their own cash, typically they name a friend of long standing, somebody they feel they know well. But most people know people who would return even a stranger's cash. I won't ask you to indicate whether you know such people, but if you don't know such people, it might be a good moment to reconsider your choice of friends. Who are you spending time with? Maybe you need to expand your circle and look for a different kind of person to hang out with. Most people know people who would do that. Well, how do you know? It can't be that this person found your cash at a previous concert and returned it. Well, it could in principle be true, but it's almost certainly not true that happened. How do you know? Most people will say, oh, I just know that person well, and I feel sure she wouldn't do that. She would feel so bad at the thought of doing it. Yeah, that's the kind of narrative. So how do we know what's going on inside a person's head? Darwin thought about that. The dog on the left is ready to do battle with a rival. Every element of its physical presentation is serviceable to that end. Its ears are pricked forward, its eyes are wide and darting about, it's ready to spring forward. The little muscles that surround the hair on its back are all instantly contracted. The hair stands on end. That makes it bigger. And because dogs each have a rule, defer if the other guy's bigger than me. If you don't do that, you look smaller than you really are, and so on. So Darwin reasoned that because you had to do that so quickly, the moment there was emotional arousal in the brain, all this happened from autonomic nerve impulses without any thinking involved in the process. If it didn't happen quickly, you'd be at a hopeless disadvantage in your combat with a rival. And so he said it was as if we had a window we could open and look inside the dog's brain and see what the emotional condition of the dog was. The signaling function of that condition didn't play any role in its evolution. Note that'll be an important point in a moment. The other dog just needed to deal with the fact that this dog was going to be a good battler, and that was the main thing. Darwin said that there are also links between nervous impulses in the brain and muscle movements in the human face. In particular, if you look at the pyramidal muscles, those are the ones at the bridge of the nose, and the corrugator muscles here in the center of the brow, they can be manipulated in concert in such a way as to produce this expression. The eyebrows are elevated at the center and they fall off toward the edge. The brow has got the furrows horizontally. Again, go to your home tonight, stand in front of the mirror, and try to make that expression happen on command. Most people cannot do that. But I'll say, I made this drawing all by myself. I don't have any professional training in art. I can show this diagram in any country, and people will have a rough idea of what this person is feeling. This person is feeling sadness, concern, guilt, some narrow band of emotion is indicated by that. And it might be advantageous for other people to know that you're feeling such an emotion. Does this person care about me? I've just been injured. If she's not manifesting that expression, maybe she doesn't really care about me. As I wrote in my 1988 book, a blush may reveal a lie and cause great embarrassment at the moment, but in circumstances that require trust, there can be great advantage in being known to be a blusher. I can tell you something that I assure you is true. If you know that if it's revealed to be false, I'll blush, or that if in making the statement, even better, I'll blush, then the fact that I don't blush is a reason for you to trust me. It's an asset if I can communicate that to you. But here's the difficulty. This was the most challenging issue that I encountered in writing this book. A signal cannot evolve because it's a signal. The reason is that in order for any trait to evolve, the small mutation that produces the first step to building that trait has to be advantageous. It has to yield benefits that are greater than whatever costs attend to it, or the next step won't happen. It will die right with the first step. So this is Tinbergen's derivation principle, and he's got a great example. The dung beetle. The dung beetle gains advantage because it looks like a piece of shit. Predators don't eat it because of that resemblance. The question is, how did it come to look that way? Imagine you were trying to escape predation for a similar, and you had a small mutation, any small mutation. Nobody would think you looked like a piece of shit as a result of a small mutation. they would not know what to think. Whatever the effect of the mutation was, it wouldn't have any effect on anybody. So the next mutation couldn't be selected for that reason. Tinbergen's argument was that the dung beetle became so strongly alike a piece of dung because it was purely by accident resembling dung by just enough to fool the very most nearsighted predator in the first place. It was an accident. Once it fooled the most nearsighted predator, then evolution could select further mutations that would make it more look like a piece of dung. So, for example, the dead leaf butterfly, that's the wing of a butterfly. I can't believe that that's what it is, but that is in fact what it is. You can Google it. It's exquisitely like the wing of like a dead leaf. But it was only because the wing happened to look enough like a dead leaf by accident in the first place that mutations could be selected that made it look that much more like a... So how did a trait that made you honest when no one's looking evolve? There's some signal of it, but if the first mutation that produced a signal of it, nobody would know what that meant. And so it couldn't be favored by evolution. This is the argument I developed in my 1988 book. It was that suppose people are generally impatient. We evolved under conditions of extreme risk. Life was very dangerous. We could be eaten by predators or starve or be denied water at a short notice. If we didn't focus on immediate threats to survival, we probably didn't survive. And so focusing on instantaneous costs and benefits was probably a very adaptive posture for creatures evolving in very harsh environments as we did. Under safer environments, we can afford to look further into the future. But the human reward mechanism isn't very good at that. If you give people a choice between an early small reward and a larger later reward, people will often choose the small early reward, even when it would make much more sense economically to choose the larger late. It's impatience. You know you shouldn't eat that second piece of chocolate pie. You'll have to go to the gym much more often, but there it was on the dessert tray and it looked so good, you do it. If we have cooperation problems, we want to establish cooperative relationships with other people. If you and I cooperate now, then you'll trust me tomorrow to cooperate. But if I cheat you now, you won't trust me tomorrow. Well, why don't I cooperate now, hoping to get the successful interaction tomorrow? Because tomorrow is tomorrow and today is now. I want to cooperate, but I'm too impatient. I cheat now. So the fact that I don't cheat now is even in situations where you could see me if I cheated, is an indication that I've got a certain measure of patience or self-control. And these emotions so suppose I feel guilt if I cheat you. Nobody knows I feel guilt. How can that help me? Well, if I feel guilt now. And that makes me cooperate with you now, and that makes you willing to cooperate with me tomorrow. So by feeling guilt now, I do get a benefit. But the fact that I feel guilt now when I cheat, that first role of that emotion was to solve the repeated cooperation problem. That's a very different problem from the one-shot cooperation problem. But the fact that I solved it by feeling guilt helps me solve the one-shot cooperation problem too. I feel guilty if I cheat you now, and therefore I don't cheat you now. That explains why we think reputation matters. Why should reputation matter? Suppose everybody were a rational Homo economicus. Then he wouldn't cheat when anyone's looking, and so if we discover he has a good reputation, all we discover is that he hasn't cheated when anyone's looking. Of course not. He cheats only when people aren't looking. And yet, we all investigate reputations when we hire people. And the reason is that people are not homo economists. They do cheat when people are looking. And the fact that nobody's caught them cheating means that they probably have some internal mechanism that discourages them from cheating. We tried to see whether people could predict who would cheat in these simple games. This is my two psychologist colleagues, Dennis Regan and Tom Gilovich. We had people play one-shot prisoners' dilemmas with one another for cash. They played in separate rooms. They talked with strangers for only 30 minutes. They would predict who would cheat and who would cooperate. The cheating rate was only 26%. The predicted cheating rate, of course, would be 100%. It's not a novel finding to find a low cheating rate. Many studies have found that. Our interest was whether you could predict who would cheat. And after talking with a perfect stranger for 30 minutes, if you predicted your partner would cheat, your partner was 57% likely to cheat. The base rate of cheating was only 26%, so more than twice as accurate as base forecasting. We can predict who'll cheat. And because we can predict who'll cheat, we can form alliances with people in situations where the venture doesn't succeed unless no one cheats, even though no one's looking. We looked at the behavior of subjects in our experiment according to what they had studied in college. The economics students were much more likely to cheat than the non-economic students, which is why I emphasize this in my economics courses. I think in many courses that stress the self-interest model, they predict that people will cheat in these games. And what we know is that if we tell you, oh, we happen to have seen your partner's form, she cheated in your game, everybody cheats in response to that, of course. And so if your training is to predict that others will cheat in these situations, it's no surprise that people would be more likely to cheat in these situations. That's the expected outcome. But that's not the way the world works, and I think it's important for students to know that. So come back to my thought experiment. Can you predict who would return your money? I can make. So we actually tried to do an experiment to test whether people could predict this. They wouldn't let us run this experiment. It was thought to be too psychologically damaging to people to be involved in an experiment like that. But I think people can predict, and we have at least some other indirect evidence that they can. So I urge my students to remember, you're going to go out, you're going to take a job, you're going to be considered for promotion at some point, maybe a year or two later. Your supervisor is going to have an informed opinion about whether you would return her lost envelope full of cash if you found it. Maybe she wouldn't put it in just those terms, but there are things about you that will reveal to her whether to believe you're the kind of person who would cheat in a situation where, and it's compellingly in your advantage to be perceived as a person who would not cheat under those circumstances. That's who you want other people to think you are. And the best way for them to think that about you is actually to be that kind of person. So we get it completely wrong in economics by saying that people come into the world with well-formed identities and preferences. No, that Aristotle knew that was not how things work at all. We become who we are very slowly in the course of living. We form habits, we form practices, and our brains develop along pathways that are influenced by what we do. So each time you do the right thing when no one's looking, you become more likely to do the right thing when no one's looking the next time. And over time, you become that sort of person, and your supervisor will somehow or other manage to perceive that about you. So those were the three collections of ideas that I most wanted to share with your students, Helena, and I'm going to quit there. And I took almost exactly the amount of time that you initially allocated to me.
Well, is it working? Yeah. Well, so thank you very much, Bob. Thank you. And now it's time for questions and answers. So please be patient. We will give you microphone to hear your questions. So who will be the first one? Yeah.
So I have a question related to the middle part of your talk, when you ended about discussing about the market failure, right? About the table of society A
Yes.
and B. So isn't it because actually the government, or more or less no one really knows how to achieve the society B? I mean, this is a kind of ideal state. Most of us would probably pick up this society, you know, having more free time and so on, even at the cost of having less personal money or items. But how to reach this? Any thoughts about that?
How to do what with it?
How to establish rules or laws that would make the society more like B and not like the current, say, egoistic society A?
Yeah, that's a very provocative question, of course, and I think if you turn certain people loose and said, make society B happen, they would do many things that I would not approve of. I think it's very important to regulate people's individual decisions with the lightest possible touch. So I gave the example of banning big cars versus taxing cars by weight. That's an example of what I have in mind by that statement. The one policy that I have long advocated so far with no success, I'm old now, I don't know if I'll live to see it happen, but I hope I will, is to abandon the progressive income tax and in its place adopt a progressive consumption tax. And what that means is that we would report income to the tax authorities as we do now. Then we would document how much we had added to our savings during the year, as in many countries we do for tax-sheltered retirement savings accounts. Then we have two numbers, your income and your savings. Your income minus your savings, that's how much you spent. And we tax that number at a very low rate for low values of that number. But then going higher in the scale, there's no limit on how high you could tax extra consumption. Once you're consuming 5 million euros a year, the tax on the next euro could be 200% or 300%. Just make the extra spending at very high levels be much more expensive than before, and that would shift resources away from, because virtually all consumption at that level is positional, it would shift resources away from positional consumption and make them available for non-positional consumption. The main non-positional consumption we need to increase spending on now is climate control. It's going to be very expensive, but that steep curve showing income growth with the market means that the resources are there. Somebody estimated that it would be $5 trillion a year to achieve climate stability. That's like 5% of world GDP. That's like missing out on 3 years of growth. We did that in 2008 to 2010. We missed out on 3 years, and the world didn't end. We could do that. But we need, so I think generally changing people's incentives in gentle ways is better than EU-style command regulations, as I see it. But yeah, that's the right question to ask. What exactly do we have to do? But the evidence is very clear that if you spend an hour a day in a traffic jam, you're less healthy and you're less happy than if you spend 30 minutes on a tram going to work.
Okay, next question. to who needs leave for next lecture, so please, it's time now. But we will stay with other
Yeah, if
people,
anybody
but
wants
there
to
are
stay,
some,
that's fine. Yeah.
Some students, they have other lectures,
Yeah, sure.
so they need to go to other lectures. For the rest, I have information. We have this room available for other times, so who would like to ask, so please stay here. I explained to Bob. Well, so it's some teachers are going to teach. Okay, teachers are allowed to go as well. So, any other question to Professor Frank? Because his ideas for us might be sometimes strange or pretty new. So. You are the second?
There is somebody else. I have a question. All time I was thinking about you lecturing 32 years ago. Your approach to topic has not changed, but the level is much higher. But I have a very ordinary human question. What cost and benefit, cost including opportunity cost, you had when coming here? What cost and benefit? I know it's not yet over. There will be one more evening and morning tomorrow, but nevertheless, do you think you can tell us at least some of these costs, including opportunity cost and benefit?
So I'm going to imagine me thinking about your invitation when you first offered me the opportunity to come here. The fact is that during the last 3 years, I've done relatively little traveling. That's been primarily out of a desire not to be exposed to COVID on airplanes and in public places. And so, in general, I say no to invitations, just thinking that both for climate reasons and for health reasons, better to give a presentation on Zoom than to get on a plane and burn a lot of fuel and get exposed to. All the airplanes, they examine the wastewater, and there's heavy COVID loads in the wastewater of every plane that flies. So it's still a risk. I just recently read an article that said, well, we should have known about this virus from the beginning, that of course it was going to cause horrible problems. Every new virus has that effect when humans encounter it for the first time, but that this one is evolving much as would have been expected for any other virus. Gradually it becomes endemic and we just have to learn to live with it. So I think I had gotten mostly to the point where I would say to myself, all right, so now that's just part of what it means to travel. You have some risk of that, but we live with it. My opportunity cost these days in other ways is really quite low. I'm retired from teaching as of July 2020, and so I'm not, I don't have a difficult schedule to keep. I didn't have to apologize to a lot of people. I've missed 3 tennis games during the past week. That gives my sore knee a chance to feel better, so it's not all cost. But I so very much enjoyed the people I met and the experience I had when I was here in the early 90s, that seemed like a very big benefit looking ahead to the prospect of coming here. And I have to say, it's been a bigger benefit even than I imagined. People have been incredibly hospitable to me. I've had almost too many people looking after me, not a moment to think an idle thought, because everybody has me so busy all the time. But it's been wonderful. We went to a pub quiz last night. I never did that before. So there are many benefits beyond the ones I was hoping to enjoy by coming.
Thank you. And I can only add, in comparison to Robert Frank, my benefit is much higher than cost in this time.
So next question, please.
So, was it me?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's you.
So, if I may, yet one question related to the A and B society that bothers me a lot. So, I remember some time ago I read the analysis about job hours that are considered to be normal. And as you put the example of Adam Smith time, I think that at the time was maybe like 16 hours per day considered to be standard. And since then, the, say, working load decreased. And since 30s, I think last century, when 8 hours per day, so 40 hours weekly was reached, since then, no change at all, more or less, in general. I mean, do you have any idea why this 40 hours weekly is now considered to be standard? And do you see, would there be any chance to change it? Me personally, I'm always thinking about how to reduce my working load. I haven't succeeded so far, so it still bothers me, this question. So why 40 actually?
I mean, this is a very vivid example of the distinction between positional and non-positional consumption. So leisure is very non-positional. The human flourishing studies show that people have more time for exercise, for time with family members, for time with friends, for time with travel, things of that sort, are much, much happier, other things equal, controlling for other factors, than people who work longer hours. The only hours reductions that have been significant, that have been achieved historically, have been achieved by regulation. Because, well, there are many professions where there are no regulations about how long you work. Law firms are a conspicuous example, and it's quite common for junior people in law firms to work 80, 90, 100 hours a week. And there's a study published in the American Economic Review. Which would you take? A 10% pay cut and 10% fewer hours, or your current package? And virtually everybody said they would take the 10% pay cut with 10% fewer hours. But only if others did it. If I work 10% fewer hours and everybody else doesn't, then I look like a lazy law associate. I'm much less likely to be named partner after 6 years. If we all do it, then it's like everybody taking a safer workplace and lower wages. So it's through regulation that we will achieve any reduction in hours worked. It's very difficult to regulate in some sectors. You know, how do you regulate a professor? Now, the only question they ask is, how many papers does he have in A journals? And if that's what they ask, then if you work Friday night and Saturday night and Sunday afternoon on producing yet another paper, your chances of getting promotion go up. And so that's what people do. It's very, very difficult through formal regulation to control how many hours people work if they don't work under controlled conditions the way many people do not, especially now. So yeah, we'll have to invent new ways to change our incentives. I think the progressive consumption tax indirectly affects that, because so if you get to be a partner in the law firm, you earn a lot more money. But if having that much more money doesn't make such a difference, because if you spend that much more money on something, it's taxed at a high rate, then the reward for working the long hours would be smaller. But yeah, it's a hard question.
Next question. Who is willing to ask next? Yeah, please.
I will try to, but so personally as a student, I'm new to economics, so I have no like theoretical I'm starter. So, but as you talked about environmental issues, and a little bit, I always had the thought like, why does economics have to always be, growing? Why cannot be like, I don't know how to phrase the question, but like, if we want to help the world, it cannot be growing till the end, like to eternity. It has to slow down a little bit. Is that right, or how would you explain that?
Yeah, no, that's a very important question that you've asked, and there is an influential political movement in the world now called the no growth movement. They say growth is an evil thing and we must cause growth to stop. And it's true that much of the trouble we have has been a consequence of growth of many types of things. But I think the idea that there can't be growth is simply a misunderstanding of what growth means. The problems that we have are all a result of growth of certain kinds of things. More cars burning fossil fuels today than 10 years ago, that's a problem because of growth. More people flying across the Atlantic than there were 50 years ago, that's a problem because of growth. Growth in many other kinds of things don't cause any problems at all. If somebody takes piano lessons and pays the piano teacher a fee and then learns to play the piano proficiency, nobody is injured by that. There's no harm at all. If somebody plants flowers around her house and others derive pleasure from that, the seed she bought or the flower plant she bought to plant adds to GDP and growth, but it didn't cause any problem to anybody. The key is to penalize behavior that causes harm to others. I think to do that through the tax system is generally the least invasive way to do that, but we need to halt the consumption of things that give off harmful side effects. And taxing them is by far the method of curbing them that is most respectful of freedom. We could have car trips fall by half. So the things that are causing harm need to shrink, not grow. But in their place, we can build more machines like the one that Climeworks has in Finland, in Iceland, that sucks air in, filters the carbon out of the air, makes it into rocks, and then buries it in the earth. That adds to GDP too. We spend a lot of money on that. That's good growth. We need to have growth in those things and shrinkage in other things. But having growth in income overall helps us do what we need to do. There have been studies that when the economy is growing, people are much more generous towards the common good. When there have been changes in social legislation that tries to reduce discrimination and helps the poor, and that kind of legislation is much more likely to be adopted when the pie is growing than when it's shrinking. So I don't think the overall negative growth movement is a good development. I think we want to grow, but we want to grow in the right ways.
Okay, next one here.
May I ask about your proposed consumption tax?
Sure.
I perhaps didn't understand it right, but wouldn't that make people only to keep their money in the banks? they wouldn't spend so much, so they wouldn't have higher taxes. So we will have money, but only in the banks.
Yeah, so the question is, if we tax consumption, won't people spend less? That's precisely the point, is that they will spend less. What do they do with their money? They put it in the bank, but it doesn't stop there. Then the question is, what does the bank do with it? The bank has people whose job it is to decide what are the most productive projects that could be funded by new investment. So maybe we need to rebuild the electric grid so that we can have more of it fed by solar and wind. We need to spend money to do that. Where does the money come from? It comes from financial institutions that loan those euros to people who invest it. So yeah, if we tax consumption, people will spend less on consumption. So consumption will go down. Investment will go up, and the tax on consumption will yield revenue that will enable government spending of a certain type to go up as well. And what we know is that in the long run, if there's more investment, so this is GDP, if there's more investment, the capital stock grows, the productivity of workers grows, and so people earn higher wages than in the past. And over time, it may be that we consume only 70% of GDP rather than 85% or 90%. But GDP may grow more in total so that 70% of a big number is actually higher than 85% of what the GDP would have been if we didn't adopt this policy. And it's even a great business cycle remedy if you are in a deep economic downturn like the Great Recession of 2008 and 9, you could say we enact this law that says the moment unemployment returns to the normal level, we will adopt a progressive consumption tax. Then people say, oh, the consumption tax is coming, I better buy my luxury car, I better buy my yacht, I better build the extra wing on my mansion today before the tax kicks in. So we get a huge expansion of spending without the government having to borrow any money. It's not the best way to expand the economy, but compared to unemployment,
it's a brilliant idea. So, okay, next question. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. My question is, are we able to define what is consumption and what is an investment? If I buy a new house, is it an investment or is it a consumption? If I buy gold, is it an investment or is it a consumption?
Yeah, the question is, how do we know what is consumption? And consumption in economic terms mean what we use up today. And so if you buy a house or you buy a coat, you don't use all of it up today. You use up some of it today. It depreciates. The coat won't last forever. It'll last 5 years, 10 years. So yeah, in an ideal scheme, you would say you count only the part that you consume now. And with housing, that expenditure is so big, we actually do have to say if you buy a 10 or I don't know, 100 million crown apartment, you didn't consume 100 million crowns this year, you consumed only 1/20th of that. And so we would adjust your tax to allow that to be only a small part of the expenditure be consumption. No, you do it for houses. If you buy a painting, tough luck, that's consumption, even though it's still there after a year. Just for, I know it's an investment for you, but I say too bad. The alternative is too much administrative expense. It's the world's unfair. What can I say?
The most simple system is the most effective. It's true, even it's not fair sometimes. Not communism. Next question. Yes, please.
He wanted to ask a question too.
Hello. So, with a great respect, you talked about conflict between individual and group, or individual or society. Like, I, as a fan of Austrian economy school, I believe that these terms do not quite match the reality. Because, like, groups don't have any goals.
Because what? I'm sorry?
Group or society do not have any goal itself. Like, it's a metaphor, we talk like that, but I believe that society don't have any will itself. It's only the individuals that are interested in their own goals. So, like, I think that by definition, it needs always an authority that makes these goals, or that says that what is good and what is bad for the society. And I'm quite concerned that the authority do not always make the decisions that aims for the interest of individuals. And we have no guarantee that it will not aim for itself.
So do I understand that you're saying that only individuals have goals, and
Yes,
there are never goals held by groups of individuals that are in conflict with individual goals and deserve priority over them? Is that what you're saying? There are never such cases?
Yes, quite. Like, we use the term of goals of the society, but I think it's only a metaphor, not an exact term.
Let me give you an example and ask your opinion about it. It's well known that when there is no rule, hockey players will skate without helmets. How do we know that? Because we've had many leagues compete when there is no rule requiring helmets. But we know also that hockey players often vote for rules requiring helmets unanimously. And it's because they conclude correctly, I believe, that if they are not required to wear helmets, it will be almost imperative that they take them off, because you get a small advantage by taking your helmet off. You can see better, you can hear better. Your team is more likely to win if you take your helmet off. And yet we know that the best response of the opposing team, if one team takes its helmet off, is to also take the helmets off. Then you've got both teams skating without helmets, both teams exposed to serious injury who wouldn't have been. And so why can't they collectively say it would be better if we all wore helmets? And yet we know that unless there's a rule, nobody will wear one.
And the question?
Why is that? I think I have offered you an example of a case of individuals having goals and a group having goals. The two goals are in conflict, and the goal that we think should be honored is the group goal, not the individual goal.
Like, you get an application that matches this quite well, but in the case of taxation, and we talked about lower consumption, it needs an authority claim or something that doesn't match goals of individuals. And we cannot be sure that these higher taxations cannot be more harmful than good.
Yeah, if the government taxes me more heavily and builds a lot of bombs and pollutes the air, that would be bad. So we can imagine situations where taxes would be spent in ways that made us even worse off. But that's why we have democracies. We try to vote out people who do that and vote in people who don't do that. But I didn't hear you respond to my question was, did I give you an example of what you said couldn't exist with the example of the rule requiring helmets?
Maybe I will need more time for that,
Okay.
Or maybe I didn't understood it well that you meant it, but I thank you for your answer.
Okay.
I'm good with it.
Thank you. Next question here.
Okay, first, thank you for our lecture. It was a really pleasant experience for me. Thank you for that. And I want to ask about non-positional goods. For example, healthcare.
Yes.
Is it better if it's in the hands of the government or if it's in a private hands, just with like more oversight from the government? Thank you.
Yeah, that's the question is healthcare a non-positional good? Yeah, it has positional elements, obviously, and non-positional elements. I think the tendency, since healthcare is often forward-looking, it's vulnerable to the short-sightedness problem. People tend to under-invest in it. So when the COVID pandemic struck, we had insufficient hospital surge capacity and so on. If that were under collective control, we wouldn't necessarily have done better, but it would have been at least possible to imagine ways we could have done better. Should the government be more involved in managing healthcare than it is? That's a very difficult question. The healthcare system in the U.S. and the healthcare system in France are the two that I've experienced personally in different countries. We had a much better experience when one of our sons broke his arm in France. The physicians were all private. You dealt with them directly. I don't think the government did anything else other than reimburse their expense. So the system seemed much less bureaucratic than the American system, where you fight with insurance regulators. And so, yeah, I think in general that's a hard question, but having people in charge who are sensitive to user interface design, that's, I guess, the general term I would use. It's a horrible problem for people who are inexperienced to figure out how to deal with this system. And there are better designs and worse designs. Whether it's government or private is a question on top of that. So I don't really have anything much intelligent to say about your question. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Well, okay.
Thanks. I'm a guest here. I'm a biologist, so thank you for your lecture. I like it. The evolution is blind. I agree with you. I have a question. Have you thought about reviewing some of your economic ideas from the theory of games based on the switches in generations? Like every generation is slightly different.
The short answer is no. That's not something I've ever thought about. Of course, the culture evolves along with the organisms in it. And I think the culture evolves much more quickly than the organisms. It can change dramatically in just a generation. The organisms evolve only very, very slowly. So yeah, we do find that the best policies in one generation are often dramatically different from what we would have chosen just 50 years ago. Or 25 years ago even. But no, that's not something I've studied.
Please.
Daniela, thank you very much for your presentation. And if I have understood it correctly, it's also, among others, about the behavioral economics. And I would appreciate your opinion why recently a lot of people by election prefer to vote populists. Is it, as you said it, because people prefer to grab the nearest benefit, not willing to wait to future higher benefits for them? Thank you.
I think that's a very interesting question to think about. What do populists do even? What unites them around the world? I think the main economic change that's occurred since 1970, I'm going to say, is roughly the time, is that during the 3 decades after World War II, incomes grew at about the same rate for everybody. The poor actually saw their incomes grow a little bit more rapidly than incomes of others. But since 1970, almost the entire income gains have gone to people at the top. And so what matters for how you feel about your situation when you ask yourself, how am I doing? You have 2 frames of reference that are invoked for answering a question like that. How am I doing relative to the past? And how am I doing relative to other people today? And on both of those dimensions, the answer is more discouraging now than it was in 1970. So the growth of the economy was 3% or more on average. After World War II, it's now been around 1.5% for much of that period. So much more slow growth and almost no growth for people at the bottom. So people at the bottom not only are having a bad comparison with the rate of change that they saw in the past, but also a bad comparison between themselves and other people. And I think the resentment that's caused among the typical people in the middle and below is very strongly linked to the appeal of populist candidates. The system's treating you unfairly, they say, and they don't have a good formula or diagnosis of why it's treating them poorly, but the people are eager to hear that they're being treated unfairly and quick to vote for people who make that charge. So yeah, I think it's a very dangerous time. We need to be quite careful who we vote for.
Okay, so on the top, please. We still have time? Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is David. I would just like to ask regarding your comments about the possible regulation. Do you think there is a possibility that with such regulation we could possibly see the hamper of the growth that we have currently that could possibly lead to, say, overall decreased level of happiness that we have? I know it might be hard to imagine it this way, but let's say if we regulate this, the time that we can spend, I don't know, by studying or so on, we could see possibly less educated population, and that could overall lead to, let's say, even decreased growth at least, and therefore possibly decreased happiness once again.
I think it's certainly possible to imagine policies being adopted that would reduce growth, and I think if that happened, that would be a bad thing. What we want are policies that will reduce the growth of harmful activities. And we know what those activities are, and we already have a number of policies that are well suited to discourage people engaging in those activities. And those mechanisms, many of them simple taxes, generate revenue that can be used to pay for things that will promote increases in output in things that we know are promoting of happiness and good health. So yeah, there's no reason that we should expect a bad outcome from regulation, but it's possible to imagine incompetent regulation leading to a bad outcome. Yeah, I tell students, the mere fact that you identify a market failure doesn't mean that any old government regulation would necessarily lead to a better outcome. There are government failures too. And so you need to identify the problem clearly and then have a very good understanding of the mechanism that you propose to solve the problem. Not all mechanisms promise to solve the problems that they're implemented in the name of solving. They make matters worse, in fact, often. So yeah, we need to be vigilant and read the proposals that the regulators put out. They might make matters worse, yes.
Maybe just one more question. Do you know about any studies that deal with this topic that you could recommend?
Well, I think the overridingly most important issue is the climate crisis. It's now 3 years old, almost 4 years old, this book. But I think the book by David Wallace Wells, published in 2019, it's called The Uninhabitable Earth. I had been writing about climate policy for 20 years and thought I knew the literature well, but I learned an enormous amount reading this book about how much more serious the threat is. None of the news that has been published since that book came out in 2019 suggests that the situation is better than described in the studies he cited. Most of it is that it's gotten much, much worse than we thought. But at the same time, there have been technical developments that suggest that the possibilities for solutions are much brighter than before. But that's still the book I recommend to people to help them experience in a vivid way why that's the issue they ought to focus on. There's lots of issues you could focus on, but that's the one I think is by far the most important.
Thank you for your answers.
A carbon tax is an incredibly important measure to adopt. People don't like any taxes, but carbon taxes could be made revenue neutral. What does that mean? You collect them all, then you give them back to the people who paid them. And here's the interesting twist. 50% of worldwide emissions come from people in the top 10% of the income distribution. So most of the revenue from a carbon tax would come from the very wealthy in the income distribution. We could return those revenues so that 80 or 90% of all voters would get more money back each month than they had paid in carbon taxes. And they would still have a strong incentive to switch from meat-based to plant-based, to switch from fuel-driven cars to electric cars, because relative prices of those alternatives would shift dramatically. The fact that political leaders haven't succeeded in persuading their voters to embrace revenue-neutral carbon taxes is the political malpractice of the highest order I've ever seen. If you had one thing you could make happen, it would be that.
Maybe just one more time. I have the same opinion on this topic, but do you think we should also pursue these practices in, let's say, areas such as education, the work time you were talking about, and so on?
I think the measures that we have adopted to limit work were effective. That's why we limited the work week, but there are many occupations that those measures don't work. So the overtime, if you're not paid by the hour, overtime rules have no effect. If they say time and a half after 40 hours, that has no effect on me. Maybe more national holidays would be a good thing to have, but short of that, the progressive consumption tax, I think, is the best instrument to weaken incentives to work long. I mean, we've always had measures to encourage more leisure. The religions all have Sabbath days. Why? Because people would work all 7 days if they weren't discouraged from doing that, because they could get ahead. But if everybody takes the day off, nobody loses ground. We do that, and we could find better ways to do that going forward.
Well, so I do not see any other. Okay, Bob. Again.
Okay, thank you all for coming. And,
thank you. It was perfect. Thank you very much.